Hello and welcome to the Nature Garden Podcast with me, Carl Steinson, and the weekending show team from Lionheart Radio. It's a chance to take a wander down the garden path and country lane with the birds and the bees and the flowers and trees, and an opportunity to hear stories from the past and present. In this episode, from scented wonders to hybrid teas, we adore roses, and Tom Pattinson's looking through rose-tinted spectacles. Steve Lowe from the Northumbria Rivers Trust is working on a ladder for fish. Tom Cadwallender's here to tell us about one of our large and colourful residents, the shelduck. And beekeepers are bracing themselves for a new threat to colonies, the Asian hornet. We'll have more on this destructive invader and how you can help our bees. All coming up on the Nature Garden Podcast.
Take my hand and come with me, darling, down to the shoreline. Take my hand and come with me, darling, down to the shoreline.
What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Lines made famous by William Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet, and whether it be a single or a dozen, a rambling rose or a bush, we love roses, and so does Tom Pattinson.
The roses in this garden are flowering earlier this year. I'd normally expect the first flush to come about the end of this month, June, first week in July. But last week I discovered Olivia Rose Austin, a beautiful English rose, large, good form, brilliant fragrance, pink, outflowering, supported by several buds just opening, and that's the same story with other roses round the garden. This had me thinking, appreciation of roses. It goes back 3,500 years at least, so I thought a little potted history might be in order. Palace of Knossos, if you visited that before, on Crete, roses depicted on the walls there, 1600 BC. Amazing. Some of the Egyptian tombs had roses depicted in there too. And of course the Greeks, one of the writers, Theophrastus, writer, poet, I think he fancied himself as a bit of a gardening pundit because he recorded that you must remove the old wood from roses to get the best flowers. He also wrote that sighting is important for good bushes. And the third thing which appealed to me was better grown from stem cuttings than from seed. Couldn't argue. Thousands of years later, all three of those things hold good. What about the jolly old Romans? What did they ever do for us? Well, of course, they brought roses over with them. They used them in their food, wine, for medicine, and they loved the perfume, of course, and those who could afford it slept on beds of rose petals. Amazing stuff. In the Dark Ages, appreciation of roses faded, I guess, but the early Christians used them, that is the hips, as rosary beads, and they were used in medicine as well, of course. And some of the later churches built, they had those rose-patterned windows, didn't they? And still exist. Medieval times, there were two main roses around. One was we call it the red rose of Lancaster, or Rosa gallica, which is the apothecary rose. That was around. And so too was the Rosa alba, the white rose. I call it the Crusader rose. Of the two, I have them both in this garden, by the way. It's living history, growing them here. Of the two, it's the Crusader rose, the white one, that is of most interest to me, because some years ago, a friend rang and said he had a relative living on the outskirts of Nottingham who'd just bought a moated farmhouse from medieval times, and it had been owned by a crusader, and in the deeds he'd found reference to a Crusader rose in the walled garden. They went out to look for it amongst the rubble, and there it was covered, but there were at least some stems showing, and he'd brought 4 of these stems back to Northumberland as cuttings. And he said he didn't want the responsibility of having to root them. So he shared it with me. I got 2, he got 2, and lo and behold, all 4 rooted. Reference the Crusader rose, or Alba rose, in my garden, still growing at the moment. Living history. Throughout the medieval period, roses drifted in from Europe, and those roses were well accepted, I guess, but there was one thing missing, or 2 things missing. One of the things missing was they didn't have repeat flowering, and there wasn't good form amongst them, no big, bright roses. And this repeat flowering was really something we take for granted today. But at that time, about, say, 18th century, middle of the 18th century, 1750s, something significant happened. China, which had for all intents and purposes been cut off in terms of communication from the Western world, people started visiting there, and they brought back with them roses. And those roses had different strengths, a different gene pool altogether. They were repeat flowering, and there were some good forms amongst them. The tea roses came from China. We later call them hybrid tea roses. So, what a mixture. The best of our pool with the strength and hardiness, toughness of this country, and the Chinese roses with their repeat flowering attitude in their genes and better form. So when the 2 came together, the hybridists got to work, we got the roses we have today.
Now, it's a coastal resident that can also be found around inland waters, and it's quite jazzy looking. Birder Tom Cadwallender from the British Trust for Ornithology can tell us more about the colourful shelduck.
If you walk down onto the estuaries on the Northumberland coast any time now, one of the most common birds you're going to see, and it's a duck species, and it's the shelduck. Shelduck are quite big, you know. They're quite distinctive in their own ways. They're the size of a small goose. They're bigger than the mallards, and you'll see mallards around, plenty of those on our river systems. But the shelduck nest in burrows, and they'll kind of either excavate themselves, or they'll use old rabbit burrows or something like that. But they're like them in dunelands, but they're close to water, always close to water. And the way we tell the shelduck is as I mentioned, they're quite big birds, and they're largely kind of all white, or they're kind of a lot of white on them, and the sexes are slightly different. But I'll describe the male to you to get us underway. But the male has this dark green or kind of look black head, and it comes right down onto the neck, and it has this nice sort of chestnutty breastband. And dark wings when they're standing, but in flight they have black and white wings. It's the kind of the outer feathers, the primaries and secondaries, which are black, and the mantle is the bit that joins to the body, and they're the kind of the smaller feathers on the wing, and that is white. But the wings are the flight feathers are black. But the main difference between males and females is that the male has they've both got red bills, but the male has this red knob just on his forehead, and it's quite distinctive. It stands out quite a bit. You know, you can pick them out quite easily. But the female hasn't got this, but she still has the red bill, but hasn't got this knob. And currently there's something like about 14, 15 pairs on the Alne estuary. But if you've got Lindisfarne, it's great. There's huge expanse of mud up on the near the causeway and running south from the causeway. And we can see hundreds and hundreds of these birds, and they're quite distinctive standing out on the mud there. And they're all going to raise young, and they'll raise something like 14 chicks in one go. But there's a higher rate of attrition. They never fledge all of these, but they'll bring them out and they'll get them onto the water. And gradually over time, the numbers diminish because of predation and the lack of being able to survive. But there are plenty of them there. And it's interesting, they have this, or many of them have this molt migration at the back of the summer after they've got the young away. Many of them will leave this part of the world and go down to the Low Countries, and an area known as the Hook of Holland or the German Bight, in that sort of kind of general area. and they'll go on a molt migration. So they will molt all their flight feathers at the same time. Wildfowl have this strange strategy of molt, and they will drop all their flight feathers at the same time. And that makes them flightless, basically. You think that's a bit of a funny thing for a flying creature, a bird, to do, actually become flightless for a short period. But anyway, that's what they do. And many with the shelduck go down to the German Bight on their molt migration. So they will spend a lot of their time down there, the back of the summer and the early autumn, and they'll gradually make their way back up again in the turn of the winter and fill back in, ready to come back into the breeding grounds, and they'll come back in pristine plumage. But they will. Some birds will hang around through the summer and into the autumn. They've adapted their molt migration to actually molt in this country, as opposed to traditionally going down to the Low Countries of mainland Europe. But they're quite a spectacle, these birds, and they really have adapted. And they have this crazy thing that they do. They when they feed, they're filter feeders, and they'll feed on hydrobia, which are small crustaceans, and they will filter them. You'll see them on mud after the tide's gone back, and they'll just be moving their head. They'll be walking around, and they'll be moving their heads back and forward, just filtering out the mud and finding out what's in there. And they'll sort of gobble up all of these minute sort of invertebrates, and that's what they kind of live on. But it's quite an interesting sort of feeding strategy they have. So yes, they're probably one of the most colourful characters that we see on the shore at the present time. Not to be confused with eiders, of course, but that's another story.
This is the Nature Garden Podcast with Carl Steinson, Tom Pattinson, Tom Cadwallender and Steve Lowe.
Roses take the spotlight in the garden this week with Tom Pattinson, who's been looking at some of our favourites. It's amazing how many types there are and how much we adore them, Tom. And I think it's safe to say that you and Judy are big fans as well.
Yes, Carl, we do grow a few roses in our garden, as you probably well know. Not in a bed, all of one type, but scattered round the mixed border here and there, so we can search them out and enjoy the different items they have to offer. Some are grown for their fragrances, some for their form, and others purely for their history. And it's not just roses. Any plants you grow in the garden that have a bit of history attached to them, and so much interest, not necessarily just for visitors, but yourself to delve into it and enjoy it. Living history, absolutely brilliant. One of the plants I mentioned earlier, the rose plants, was the Rosa gallica, the officinalis, the rose, the apothecary's rose, and we planted it some years ago next to a privet hedge, a boundary hedge, just got it about 1 metre tall, and it was planted next to it. And of course they send underground shoots out, rhizomes, and then they come up as a stem later. So they're travelling rose. They migrate from the spot you plant them in. And this one has migrated into the middle of the privet hedge. So every year now, a privet hedge 1 metre tall, this comes up through the middle. It's just starting to flower now, stands 30 centimetres proud of the top of the privet hedge, and it starts flowering. It'll flower for a month or more. I can't cut the hedge, won't cut the hedge anyway at the moment, until at least mid-July, when the birds are finished nesting. But when I do trim the privet hedge, I go around it and leave that flowering. It's quite a little feature. Quite easily propagated. Either get one of the suckers up with roots and a stem attached, or hardwood cuttings in the autumn, straight into the autumn garden. The Alba rose I mentioned earlier, with Crusader rose, where it came from. I'm proud of that one. I love it. It sends suckers around as well, but stem cuttings it will root from. Problem is the flowers. I don't know how it's survived all these centuries, because they almost faced up towards the sky. And they're open flowers. They're white, of course, with a pink tinge to them on the pink edging. And I don't know how it managed to survive so long. Probably it's the budwood or the stem wood or the suckering that's kept it going, because some of the flowers die off when it's raining. The rain falls into the flowers themselves. we traced many years ago. The closest it was several Alba roses. This one is probably called Cuis de Nymph, or the Thigh of the Passionate Nymph. That's as close as we could get it. It's difficult because they're one or two different types of the species, of course. Anyway, moving on from that, I have another rose which offers something totally different, and that is the rose rubiginosa, and the sweetbriar of eglantine, so called because if you water it, as I watered it last week with the watering can, there's a fragrance of ripe apples comes once you've watered the leaves. If you put the leaves between finger and thumb, rub and sniff, it's fragrance of ripe apples. It is just amazing. And this one I have is called Lady Penzance, Rosa rubiginosa Lady Penzance. It's a sweetbriar, as I mentioned, and it has coppery-coloured flowers, but they're not terribly attractive. They don't last for long. It's the leaves that's the feature. I also have rugosa rose. I like them, different form again. These are the type that are used for hedges. And possibly one of the best for hedges is Rosa rugosa Rosary della Hay. Red flower. It produces big hips at the end of in the autumn, and it's good and dense for hedges, and it is drought tolerant. It can be raised from stem cuttings as well. And who could be without the little sweetheart rose, which can either be a climber or in shrub form. I have it in shrub form. I prune it severely down to about a metre, quite severely down to a metre, but it grows back up to just over 2 metres tall during the summer, which is manageable. It has the most beautiful pink buds, barely 3, maybe 4 centimetres at the outside tall, that's all, but a beautiful form they have, and they open into a fully blown flower about 4 or 5 centimetres across. It is a gorgeous little plant. It's called Rosa Cecile Brunner, the sweetheart rose, easily rooted from stem cuttings, put into the open garden in the autumn, as most of these are. English roses, David Austin's, I have 2 or 3 of those. A favourite is this one that's flowering now, Olivia Rose Austin, pink, highly fragrant. Judy chose Gabriel Oak. We found it a couple of years ago at Chelsea. It's a deep, deep pink one, looks very mysterious. It's about to flower now as well, like the character from the book and the film, Gabriel Oak. Look forward to that. It's great anticipating a new rose opening up its blooms in your garden. There's another called Chandos Beauty. It's not particularly David Austin, but it's it's the best fragrance out. It's pink as well. It's just about to open. Chandos Beauty. So, I've got the roses. What am I going to do with them? How am I going to keep them well? As Theophrastus would have written thousands of years ago in Greece. Well, I prune them, of course. I mulch them, and I feed and water them. That's important when there's drought periods such as recently. I also constantly deadheading them. Even if they repeat flowering, you must keep on removing the spent flower heads as soon as they are spent. And you go down to a lower bud, the best bud you can, just below the flowering stem, and that will develop into new flowers straight away. And of course the propagation, climbers, ramblers, rugosas, albas, sweetbriars, this can all be done with hardwood stem cuttings. Enjoy your roses during the summer. They are beautiful.
Steve Lowe from the Rivers Trust and naturally Northumbria has been busy working on ways to help fish get up and down stream on some of our waterways. Although the weather has changed his plans a bit this week.
Hello there, this is Steve Lowe from Northumbria Rivers Trust, and I'm talking here today from my bedroom, trapped in by the rain. Well, actually, the forecasted rain hasn't actually arrived, which is a real shame because today I was supposed to be out completing some work on a fish pass, which the Rivers Trust are actually building on the Hayes-on Burn, which is near Guysands in Northumberland. Now, for those of you who don't know that part of the world, it's a lovely little wooded valley, particularly in its longer stretch, down towards the river itself, where it joins a weir, which is incredibly noisy, by the way, and I think I might do a piece on that in the future for you. And in this particular location, the river narrows and it goes through a wooded gorge. Now, the gorge is not very steep-sided, but it's quite narrow, and there was a former mill there, so in order to get access to the mill and part of the mill race, there was culvert pipes and a ford put in, and that's really restricted the passage for fish. Now, most of the fish we're talking about are obviously game fish, so things like sea trout, brown trout, and obviously salmon, and they would normally get up the river when it's in decent flows. Now, river flows are actually very variable at the best of times, and particularly so at the moment. And the fact that the river was dry gave us a good opportunity to go in and replace the former structure, which really wasn't working particularly well now. And thanks to some funding that we got from Network Rail, the Rivers Trust have got a few volunteers together, and we've gone in and we've taken the old structure out and we've started to install a new one. The new structure itself, which is quite a simple pass, is almost a little bit like a maze. So you go to one side, then you go to the other side, you go to the other side, and you're effectively climbing up some ladders. So we could call it a fish ladder, perhaps, be a better description than a fish pass. And in decent flows of water, there will be areas where the fish are coming up and they can actually rest in these pools before trying to get upstream. Now, upstream, they've also got full culvert pipes underneath the ford, which is not ideal, and unfortunately there's quite a few of these in the county. So fish passage is actually quite difficult. And the work's been going really, really well this week. And then we saw the forecast and we thought, well, we'll have to pack it in on Wednesday and go back and finish it off next week. Now, unfortunately, as I say, the rains never arrived. We had a little bit, but not very much. And we could probably have worked, but yeah, arrangements had been made. So we will be completing this next week. And it's a great little job. In fact, actually, it's one of many jobs we're doing on the River Coquet, just to try to improve it, not just for fish, but obviously for the rest of the biodiversity that you get in the entire area. And I think that area is a really, really interesting one if you have a little walk around, if you're at a loss for something to do or to go for a walk when you're allowed. There's quite a lot in that area to enjoy. Not just the river itself and the woodlands associated with it, but there's also quite a lot of things like Second World War defences. What they call the Coquet stop line is there. There's a number of pillboxes and things like that, and also little bits of I would call them hidden Northumberland, really, to get your teeth into. Areas of woodland that people probably don't even know about. Lots of little wildlife friendly verges, and today is no exception. Plenty of things flying around all over the place. So I hope you've enjoyed the little chat, and we'll speak to you soon. Cheers.
And now, the Asian hornet is in the news this week, and the message is please look out for them. It's an invasive non-native species from Asia which arrived in France in 2004, and it's been spreading rapidly and it's crossed the channel. It's bad news for our bees, so if you find one, please report it. Brian Ripley, Vice Chair of the Anakin District Beekeepers Association, can tell us more.
Hi, Carl, Brian Ripley. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to introduce the Asian hornet, Vespa volatina, to your listeners. The hornet is an invasive non-native species from Asia, and if you find one, it has to be reported. It arrived in France in 2004 in a batch of crockery and has spread rapidly since then. It's now in Belgium, Italy, Spain, Channel Islands, southern England. They're a highly effective predator of insects, including honeybees and other beneficial species. It can cause significant losses to bee colonies, other native species, and can damage ecosystems if it gets a hold. They're particularly active in August and September, but they can be seen from April through to November. The queens emerging in late August, September, the virgin queens to mate and then go on to hibernate, starting a new nest in the spring. The Asian hornet queens are up to 30 millimetres in length, the workers up to 25 millimetres. They've got a mostly black body, except for its fourth abdominal segment, which is a yellow band located towards the rear. It has characteristic yellow legs, which account for why it is often called the yellow-legged hornet. Face is orange, with two brownish-red compound eyes. It's a day-flying species, ceasing activity at dusk. Sightings can be reported using the Asian Hornet Watch app, both for iPhone and Android, and available to download. You can also report sightings by email. The address is on the government website. You have to, for obvious reasons, quote location, date and number of Asian hornets you've seen. A photograph would be helpful to help the people who are trying to catch them identify it as a hornet. The nests can be found high up in trees, normally bigger than a football. If you see a nest, leave it. Don't try and remove it yourself. It can be dangerous and should only be done by experts. The hornet is spreading rapidly. There were 83 nests found in Jersey in 2019, and already nests have been found in 2020. With 200 to 300 virgin queens emerging from each nest in any 1 year, you can imagine the sort of spread and increasing density in any particular area. There's plenty of information on the websites, both the BBKA, British Beekeepers Association, and the government DEFRA website. At the moment, hornets haven't been seen further north than Hull and also Bury in Lancashire, but they do spread rapidly, and we might well find them, if not this year, certainly within the next year or two. Please look out for them. Thank you. Bye for now.
Thanks, Brian, and for more information on all things bees, please check out the website annickbeekeepers.co.uk. Well, it's been the sunniest spring since 1929, so a big hooray for the rain that we've had in Northumberland of late. Much welcome it's been, and fingers crossed you've had some too. I think it's time for some top timely tips for the garden, don't you? Over to you, Tom Pattinson.
And so to jobs for the week, which, apart from weeding and watering wherever necessary, cover fruit, vegetable and ornamentals. Beginning with fruit, there are strawberries formed out there, and there is no straw. They are strawberries after all. And the straw is put in place between the rows so that the fruit cluster can rest on them and stay away from the soil. If it rains, splashes of soil, the slugs, snails get at them easier when they're on the soil, so it looks better anyway. So I've got some straw, lining it in between the rows and rest on that. The other thing there is a net. I love the birds, blackbirds especially, coming into the garden, all birds, but when they start thieving the fruit, I get a little bit het up about it. So keep your balance and put a net on. I do put a net on the strawberries, but it must of course be bird proof, not letting them get under, because if they get under they'll panic and harm themselves. So make sure it's fixed down firmly and there's no entry for birds at all if you're putting a net on your strawberries. Next up will be the raspberries. They're ripening fairly quickly. My black currants, red currants and gooseberries are a substantial size now, and they just need to put on a little bit more weight and ripen, and we're away. So I need some nets on those as well. Bird-proof nets. Moving on to the top fruits, don't panic if you see apples lying beneath the tree, little apples, etc. The plant hasn't got a disease, it's just called the June drop. Nature takes care of when the tree has a massive crop of small fruits. It decides can't support all of these, so the tree gets rid of some of them. It's a natural phenomenon. At the end of June, if there's still too many small fruits together, you can thin what's left out yourself. But remember, the fewer fruits on the tree, the bigger they get and the better quality. If you want a lot of small fruits, leave well alone. But don't panic if you see those small apples, plums at the bottom of a tree. Moving on to vegetables. There's been some winds recently, strong wind coming through the garden. If you've got things like runner beans, of course, they'll curl anti-clockwise around the supports, the canes, the wigwams, whatever you have up for them, whatever structure. Mine are nearly at the top already, climbing. But the broad beans, different matter. They tend to go, most of the varieties of broad bean tend to grow quite tall, sometimes up to a metre tall. The wind comes, it'll flatten them, get some support in for them. I grow one called the Sutton. It's a dwarf broad bean and it just grows about knee height and it really needs support. Look around to make sure there's nothing happening, that the corn on the cob are fairly well supported because the wind can get them. Mine are tough now. They've toughened up because it's been so hot, and that's exactly what corn on the cob needs, sweet corn. It needs hot, hot sunshine. And it's going to be a good crop this year. They're looking good. They should be ready. The cobs will develop. They'll be ready by about mid-August, I'd guess. That's what happens normally. Move on to ornamentals. Ornamental plants, bedding plants outdoors, those in containers, etc., need to be out now. It's no good hanging around in pots, or I still had some hanging around the last weekend and thought, right, we're going to get the whole lot planted out and then we know where we stand with them. If they've been in pots, grown on in pots for a while, don't forget when you knock them out of the pots, they might be pot bound. Pots, there's roots going in circles at the base. If that's the case, tease them apart, water them in well. And here's the thing, I mentioned earlier that the roses have started flowering now. Deadheading roses, removing spent heads, brings more into play. This is the case with most of the ornamental plants, half-hardy annuals that we grow during the year out in the garden. Keep deadheading as the flowers die off and more will come. Water polyanthus, that's the plants that we took in I put them into the garden, lined them out. They'd been giving me a spring display, beautiful polyanthus over winter and spring actually, and I dug them up and I lined them out in the spare part of the vegetable plot, and I watered them well in. They're there during the whole of the summer, and we come to them in autumn, divide them up, split them up so we get more plants from them, and they're there ready for the following spring. But don't let them get dry over the summer period. Greenhouse finally. Greenhouse constantly needs water, and you've got a tomato crop, keep going at it, rubbing out the side shoots as they develop, encouraging the trusses, and watering. Sometimes twice a day I'm watering the greenhouse tomatoes at the moment. And keep a close watch on them for any pests, any green fly developing, and let a fresh rush of air go through. A couple of days ago, we went from the hot sun to an overcast day, a bit cooler, but I still left the door open to let that air rush through, because the tomatoes and the grapevine, they need a flow of air to stop mildew developing. That's your jobs for the week's folk.
You've been listening to the Nature Garden Podcast with me, Carl Steinson, gardener Tom Pattinson, birder Tom Cadwallender from the British Trust for Ornithology, Steve Lowe from the Northumbria Rivers Trust and Naturally Northumbria, and Brian Ripley from the Alnwick and District Beekeepers Association. We're on Twitter at Gardeners Radio, and we'll be posting blogs on our new website, naturegardennotebook.com, very soon. Thanks for listening and have a great week. Bye for now.